We wanted to get your perspective on where US-China relations are at the moment. As you know, the US has embarked on an increasingly aggressive new Cold War policy with the explicit goal of blocking the rise of China and attempting to maintain US hegemony. We saw with both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, both of these administrations launched a host of anti-China policies, including tariffs, sanctions, and international smear campaigns. And very recently, the US House of Representatives passed a bill which proposes the US spend $1.6 billion over the next 5 years on anti-China propaganda. And in September of this year, 2024, the US Congress passed 25 anti-China related bills in 1 week alone. And this week was dubbed China Week. Victor, what are the ramifications of this? And why do you think the US is pursuing such an aggressive policy? And what do you think are the possibilities for a different path?
Well, first of all, let's try our best to understand why the anti-China hostility in the United States and in their turn in quite a few other developed Western countries are now reaching a frenzy pitch. As far as the United States is concerned, I'm afraid Washington is suffering from two nightmares. The first nightmare is that the United States worries that China will catch up with the size of the US economy and eventually will become larger and larger and push the United States to the margins of the world development. And the second nightmare, which is even more worrisome for the United States, is that once China becomes larger than the United States, China may start to impose its values, political systems, and ideologies onto the United States, really pushing down the United States to a second-tier country. Now, from the Chinese perspective, no country, no force in the world can deny or deprive the Chinese people of their legitimate right of economic development. And China believes that China's steady economic development will continue. And if you listen to Mr. Elon Musk, for example, he kept saying that by the middle of this century, the size of the Chinese economy will be doubling the size of that of the United States. So from the Chinese perspective, no matter how the United States behaves or misbehaves, for example, China will continue to develop. And the so-called depriving China's access to, let's say, advanced semiconductors will backfire. Each time the United States wants to deny China something or deprive China of something, China will really focus on that particular area and succeeds in making huge breakthroughs. Now, as far as the second nightmare that Washington is suffering from, China will really need to tell the United States in very straightforward and very honest way that either in the past or at present or in the future, China will never impose its views or values or political systems onto the United States. Why? Because China really respects all the countries in the world, about 200 of them, as equals, including the United States. The best way to describe that for the benefit of the people in the world is that China really believes the philosophy that your God for you and my God for me. You don't want to try to impose your God on me, and I will never try to impose my God on you. And the world is big enough to accommodate a successful United States as well as a successful China. And both China and the United States have the duty and the obligation to help all the other countries to develop, especially when we are fast entering the AI world. And if China and the United States do not get onto the same page, probably the final competition, if any, is not between China and the United States, it's between AI versus mankind as a whole. So I think the development of technologies, etc., will dictate that country-to-country competition may eventually need to be re-understood to prevent, for example, AI getting an upper hand against Homo sapien, and they dominate against human beings like we are. So I think between China and the United States is really very much agitated. They worry about losing the economic dominance without fully understanding that in many categories, China is already way ahead of the United States. For example, many people in the US Congress talk about China's shipbuilding. China's shipbuilding capacities is much, much bigger than that of the United States. So if you only look at shipbuilding comparison between China and the United States really need to be fully panicked out because they will never be able to catch up with China in terms of shipbuilding. In terms of automobile production, for example, for 2023, China's production is almost double the size of the American production, and China leads the world in terms of the EV R&D and production. And now the United States not only wanted to impose a 100% tariff on China EV cars imported from China, including EV cars made by American companies like Tesla, for example. Now, the US Department of Commerce even announced that they want to put a complete ban on any software manufactured or designed in China, which will drive EV to be run on a public road in the United States. Basically, they want to put a complete ban on anything produced in China, EV cars or EV car enabling softwares, for example. Now, this is really anti-free trade. This is put the fundamental interests of the American people to the sideline and focus on Cold Wars, for example. However, allow me to emphasize one point. You may know that there is a very distinguished professor at Harvard University who wrote a book about Thucydides' trap, etc. And the title of the book is Destined for War. It's very scary, leading people to think that maybe between China and the United States, there is a destiny that they will end up in a war against each other. I think, while I have full respect for that distinguished professor, the book is a complete fallacy. Why? While solid homework has been done to analyze all the previous cases of war, he forgot to mention one thing to mankind, that all the wars he analyzed were conventional wars. And the conclusion you arrive at analyzing conventional wars cannot be readily applied to China and the United States, two largest nuclear weapon countries. Therefore, China and the United States are not destined for war, because war between China and the United States will destroy not only these two countries, but mankind as a whole. Therefore, I came up with my own theory. It's called inevitability of peace between China and the United States, meaning whatever the problems there are between China and the United States, China and the United States need to engage with each other in peace rather than war. And peace, whether you like it or not, between China and the United States is inevitable. Why? Because the other alternative will be Armageddon. So China and the United States, no matter how Washington is unhappy about it, how agitated it is today, they need to live with the fact and come to terms with the fact that China is increasingly a very major factor in the world that they need to live up with, rather than try to derail or throw a huge wedge and try to overwhelm China, hold China down onto the ground as if there is no other consequences.